Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Glass Onion, a Knives Out mystery. Now, for the die-hard long-time viewers, it has now been, I think, over 2 years now since I started this series. My very first video was on the original Knives Out when it came out in, it came out in 2019, I believe. End-ish of 2019. I believe it was a Thanksgiving release, and this one just came out yesterday at time of recording. So it was supposed to be sort of a Christmas release. And it is an interesting... We have to talk about a bunch of the production and naming things. And in order to do that, I guess we have to talk about the first one. We have to talk about Rian Johnson again. I have talked about Rian Johnson several times in this series. Talked about Knives Out. Talked about, in a cursory sense, the Star Wars movie that he made that shall not be named. I talked about Looper, and I've talked about Looper and Brick and a couple of other things. I did a video on Brick. I really like Rian Johnson. I think he is a good writer and a good director, and I am constantly curious about what he's working on. Generally speaking, I will say I think this continues my curiosity for what he's working on, and especially after having very recently watched a bunch of Agatha Christie adaptations, both good ones and bad ones over the last couple of years, and especially very recently, to see what a modern take on murder mystery slash whodunit slash sort of like investigative thriller comedy type of thing can be in a modern age. I do need to go back and rewatch the original Knives Out because my memories of it are a little bit hazy, having now been over 2 years. But my general feeling on it was that it was a very strong showing, and minus a few issues with plotting and being a little bit too happy to show off just how clever it was being at certain times. That it was a very strong entry into a mostly dead genre in the current time. This does continue that trend, but does have some substantial changes and different approaches from the original Knives Out that could be good or bad. And generally, I think maybe for the positive, we'll see. Obviously, I'm in favor of like a modernization and a revitalization of the genre, and I appreciate what both in the in Knives Out and in Glass Onion they do with the setting to establish it in a more modern context, whereas the original Knives Out is very sort of it's about class imbalances and modern economic dichotomies and social classes and all these sorts of things. This one is much more about like a modern socio-political landscape and the tradings of politics and power, and how power gets you places and doesn't get you places. So it's an interesting premise on its own in doing something very different from the original. We do have to talk about the name. They put themselves in an awkward spot with the original one because Rian Johnson probably didn't necessarily, expect it to do as well as it ended up doing. I think it ended up grossing like more than 10 times what it was originally put into it. And that was a normal theatrical release as far as I'm aware. This one is through Netflix. It did get a theatrical release, but in a very limited capacity. And so obviously it's not subject to all the same metrics. but is working on allegedly about the same budget of $40-ish million. So it's still relatively low budget in the grand scheme of things. I'm getting off the original topic, which is that the name is awkward because the through line between this movie and the last one is the detective, Benoit Blanc, who is played, I think, pretty excellently by Daniel Craig. As I mentioned in the first, in the other movies video, I think his the sort of southern affect that he puts on is generally seems to me to be very good. There's a couple of like line reads that are just like, I don't know, dial it back like 10% on that particular read. It was just a little bit too over the top. This sounds a little too much like the I'm just a humble Southern lawyer. Like a little, it's edging a little too close to that. So maybe like dial it back a little bit. But other than that, generally like perfectly believable, and at no point, especially since I haven't seen him in a little while, I think he's perfectly believable as not a Brit. So I think he does excellently as a continuation. It does have the problem of Knives Out as a name was an appropriate name for the first movie, but is not in any way appropriate for the second one because the only through line is this detective character. But you can't call it Glass Onion, a Benoit Blanc mystery, because nobody knows the name Benoit Blanc. In the first movie, he's a relatively minor character. He's more of a facilitator of the story. Whereas in this one, he is much more of a character unto himself, much more directly engaged in how the actions unfold, and much more directly involved. This obviously parallels something like Poirot, which I believe Rian Johnson has specifically said was a direct influence on the writing of the original film and this one. And as I understand it, they've already been optioned for a third one, and are probably in the works for a fourth and fifth. Sidebar, apparently, despite the budget for the film being $40 million, Netflix's bid to buy the rights to the property, like to option the next films, was close to $500 million, and that basically went to, I think, like Johnson and his writing partner and Daniel Craig, who is like a major producer on the series. Kind of like, I mean, it's inside Hollywood shit, and you'd hope that more of that money would end up in the production rather than directly in people's pockets. But hey, if artists are doing well and are putting out good work and new things, then great. You hope it gets spread around, but better that than the establishment, I suppose. Sidebar over. I'm not sure how I feel overall about Benoit Blanc as a character. Obviously, someone like Poirot or Sherlock Holmes or a number of other like famous historical detective characters have a lot more sort of cachet behind them. And admittedly, that is in no small part due to the mass of media that's already behind them. Historically speaking, obviously, I have not, well, as far as I know, I haven't been alive when any of, I don't know when the last Poirot mystery was actually written. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. They have big histories behind them, and it is hard to make, well, especially in movies, it is hard to get any original script made. It is hard to get anything new as an IP made in any form of substantially invested media. And especially for an ongoing series and a character, I think that is a problem both from a funding standpoint of how do you convince the moneyed interests in art to be willing to put their money into something potentially risky and potentially new, and obviously part of the answer is low budget. But the part of it is on the artists as well to say, how do we establish this character and how do we ensure that there is sufficient writing behind the character and sufficient quality of product to make it something you want to return to. Obviously, name recognition is part of that, and I am afraid that they may be digging themselves a ditch with this one that they cannot climb out of, and it will continue to just be called a Knives Out mystery, even though that's not really appropriate. And I think it does a continued disservice to the character of Benoit Blanc if they continue to develop him in terms of establishing him as a long-term character. Now, I would love to see not just this, but a multitude of new, mystery drama type of things made that hopefully diverge a little bit, not only from the recent cinematic remakes, but since the monopoly on like television production of mystery stuff has largely been, it's mostly BBC or PBS. It's mostly fairly low budget. It's mostly very kind of dark and dour and made for an older generation. And it is often period pieces and things like that. So obviously I want to push more towards in addition to fresh new ideas, things that are more accessible to people who may not already be invested in that kind of thing. As much as I like all sorts of like masterpiece theater productions, used to be my jam when I was a kid, they just don't appeal to a lot of people, and they're very sort of hard to get into, hard to wade into. And I think this is a much more approachable piece of media, generally speaking. So I have gone off on a tangent again. I'm very happy with what we have here, and I'm going to be, even if I wasn't super happy with all of what I saw, I think I would be rooting for the production anyway. There's obviously a lot going on in this film. As far as the cast goes, we already talked about Daniel Craig, who I think is doing very well. And as I complimented the first film, I think this one also has a really strong cast. It is some notable names, including a bunch of cameos that are just fun. There's some great cameos in here. Some of them are just like overtly like, oh, look who that actor is, or look who that random celebrity is. And in a way that feels like it's not like forced. It's not like, look who we got. It's like, oh no, it actually kind of makes sense that this person would be here. This is thematically appropriate that this person would be this character, so on and so forth. And it's just kind of fun. It executes a nice balance between like, oh, it's such and such person from pop culture, and also, like they're genuinely doing a good job of playing a very minor role here or there. But also the major, like, 7 or 8 characters, however many they are all played by some kind of established actors. There's a few that are less established. But some great people that I have seen a bunch of, some great people I haven't seen so much of, and some great people who are not necessarily known for their acting work, but I think do an excellent job as well. One of the main characters is played by Janelle Monáe, who is primarily known for her musical work. I don't think I've seen any film or TV stuff with her in it, but she's really quite good. And also somebody who I initially struggled to identify who it was, but it's Leslie Odom Jr. plays another character who's like really excellent. And across the board, the main cast puts on Well, okay, they put on really good performances. However, it does get a little bit into the weeds when it comes to the characters that they are playing and the plot of the story. The characters here are a little bit more tropified than their predecessors in Knives Out. Knives Out is very focused on sort of the internal politics of this one family for the most part. And so it's familial relationships. These don't necessarily have to, they may be familial tropes rather than what I would call like social tropes or social cinema tropes, where this is the type of person who has this job and does this thing and what their preferences are and so on and so forth. That's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a little bit more overt than sort of familial tropes of like, oh, that's like Uncle Dave or whatever. Like, what a weird character to see, like was in Knives Out. It's a little bit awkward in that in that sense, but never too grating. Where it gets a little bit rougher for me is because some of the topics at hand are being addressed as like secondary literary critique or social critique are about who these people are in modern society. The story is firmly grounded in like both. It is grounded in the time of 2020. During the middle of the pandemic, which it not only acknowledges but leverages for its narrative purpose, but not in a way that's just in a way that kind of makes sense, not in a way that feels like it's trying too hard. What gets a little bit more awkward is that these characters that are being portrayed are very much I don't want to say they're like satirical characters or they're pastiches of real world cultural. I don't know how to explain this because I don't want to spoil who these people are. The problem comes because I think these characters will not age well. Is basically what I'm trying to get at. Some of these characters have jobs. Or reference modern things outside just like the pandemic stuff. That's, neither here nor there. They are characters who like fit in a very specific social cultural narrative about what the last couple of years have been like. What are the politics of this person? What is their job? What is the kind of work they do? How is that they approach their work? How much do they actually believe what they're saying versus they think they need to behave a certain way? What are the masks they wear? And that's all really interesting on its own, but it's a combination of will this age well and will it make sense to people who are 20 years younger than me or 30 years younger than me or 40 years younger than me? Will the characters themselves make sense, and also will the sort of social context and the impact of something like that resonate? Obviously, there are plenty of historical films that talk about specific eras in time, whether it's having to do with social, political, economic specifics of a time. But some of these things, some of the characters in this film are so sort of niche, and that even for a lot of contemporary audiences, I'm curious how they hold up. For somebody of my parents' generation, for example, depending on how savvy they are, even if they're pretty culturally savvy, I think a lot of the sort of niceties may end up going over their heads or just not having the same impact that it may be for somebody of an internet generation who is like in tune with the sort of mentality that went in when writing this specific thing. That was a lot of talking about sort of the subtext and who these characters are. And I kind of want to talk about one last thing, but I'm very cautious about doing it because I don't want to spoil any of the content of the movie itself. I think it's probably enough to say that the core tensions going on and the major players are, in addition to being sort of very specific to this time and place, a few of them are very reflective of real world figures as well, in a way that feels like it's edging towards what was that cursed film that I watched on the channel that I did not like? Don't Look Up? Wait, what was it called? Why can't I remember it? Hold on. We're going to stop and find out because da, 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 da. Don't Look Up. Yeah. It's edging towards that territory of just like I think I'm pretty sure I know who this is, or who this was sort of very pointed at. And that always feels a little yucky to me. And when the movie plays out the way that it does, I think it can feel a little bit both it can feel cheaply cathartic in the way that certain things end up playing out, compared to Knives Out, which feels like it's much more wholesome in the sort of satisfaction that you get at the conclusion. This one feels a little bit more vindictive, a little bit more frustrated, and a little bit more like a writer's outlashing at the world around them. I don't want to draw too much comparison to Don't Look Up. It is nowhere near the problems that one has, but there were little twinges of like, this is a little on the nose. So as far as I think that covers most of the characters and the plot. I think all the compliments I would give sort of the genre adaptations of the first one, I would give to the second one as well. It's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit more accessible, obviously with the being contextualized in a modern setting, and more modern characters. Like even Agatha Christie's stuff was very looking back in a lot of the characters like that it had. A lot of obviously Agatha Christie stuff is also about social class and economics and politics and things like that. But I feel like it's a little more backwards looking in terms of the cultural touchstones that it was aiming at, versus this one, which seems very aimed at the here and now. Overall, despite being like 2 hours and 20 minutes long, I think very nearly, it goes on at a very decent clip. Structurally, I also think it makes some really smart choices in terms of how it uses its timeline to do some smart storytelling, to re-engage you at several times throughout the film, to make sure that not only that you're on board, but to give you new context, to give you new information, and to sort of engage you in the process of resolving the various mysteries at hand. It also gives you emotional investment in goings-on that may have already happened in one view, but are maybe playing out with new information or new context later. I think there's some really smart stuff being done there. The overall production, I would say, is generally very good. A lot of the prop work, in particular, the locations that they worked with, the buildings, the costuming, obviously, is really excellent. It's just some good stuff that goes along with the casting of like getting the visuals right for your characters is really, really important. They do it really well. But the setting and a lot of the production qualities to like tell you things about the people who are there. I think I gave this compliment to Knives Out as well, of just like environmental storytelling is something that is very often forgotten. And I'm really pleased with some of the environmental storytelling that is done in this film. There are a couple of things where the final passes on the editing and post-production could use a few extra $1 million in work. There is some digital compositing and green screening that looks very rough, which is fascinating given some of the a lot of the real world stuff that probably could have been done digitally or may even be done digitally and I didn't realize it. But there are just a few shots in particular that's just like, oh man, you guys really needed to polish this digital compositing up. There's also a few edits in it that I very clearly was like, that person said a line after that person in the same shot, but they clearly didn't do enough takes and they wanted to cut this line out. And so all they did was they muted that person. To the point when the very first time it happened, I thought somebody else was talking and that they had ADR'd her line because I didn't see that there was another person in the same scene who said the actual line, and then the person whose mouth I was seeing had been completely muted. It was very weird. There's a few edits like that was just like, I get it. You were on a limited budget. You only had so many takes, and you probably didn't want to go back. Like these some of these were shot in rather specialized locations, as I understand it from the like brief stuff I was looking into on the production. And so going back to reshoot it was probably not a very viable option, especially for 40 million. So I can understand why they did it, but yeah, they're kind of glaring. However, generally speaking, I'm really happy with a lot of what's going on. The visual composition, the framing, a lot of lighting, a lot of really interesting and smart lighting, some flashy camera movement and camera work that is not overstaying its welcome and not overdoing itself. It's not clapping itself on the back and congratulating itself too hard, but it's a little like, come on, give me a high five. And you're like, all right, man, you did it pretty good there. It's just some nice work that helps to break up the visuals compared to, some of the things I've watched recently, which are just like way too self-congratulatory. This is nice and refreshing in that respect, as well as being visually very appealing. And the audio production I think is also really strong. Aside from those couple of weird edits, I don't think there was much of any ADR. The one thing I will say is that I wish this is sort of a synthesis of all the things I've talked about before. The mystery was a little bit too easy to read. It's hard. We've talked about this many times before on a number of different mystery type of things. It is a very fine line that you have to tread when writing something like this, to show and tell the readers or viewers enough to give them the information they want if they're paying really good attention. But if you give them too much, then they'll get frustrated that the movie or the media seems to be lagging behind them. Like, I already know what's happening, just move on. Or if you don't tell them enough, then you have the opposite problem, which we've seen in a couple of things, where at the end they're just like, where did you pull all of this from? I didn't get any of this. You're just pulling it out of your ass. And this does still ride that line pretty nicely, but there are a couple of clues that if you are trying to be an eagle-eyed viewer and follow along with the mystery and check out who's doing what before, and, you know, be suspicious, there are a couple of things, and in particular a couple of shots where it's like, that's just a weird thing that just happened, and there's no way that isn't incredibly important. And then it plays out the way you think, and you're like, all right, man, I wish it was a little bit more hidden. And some of that is just in like how overtly some of it is shot. Some of it is just like in editing, where it's just like, why is this shot inserted between these two other shots? It's an awkward shot to put in there. And the reason is because they want to make sure you see it. But because of the shot-to-shot editing being so jarring, the in-camera work becomes less subtle by context. There's just a few little things like that where it's like, I'm pretty sure I either know exactly what that was, or I now know it was one of these two things, or like that is deeply suspicious to the point where of course they're not going to actually do that, or they did it this way instead, or it's a misdirect or red herring or those sorts of things. Now, I admit I consider myself to be relatively savvy when it comes to mystery and crime things. It's something I like a lot and have consumed a lot of. So maybe it's a little easier for me than it is for your average viewer who has not watched something similar to this before. But it's just a little like, I feel like I have to note it. Yeah, overall, like, generally really pleased with this one. I think that the original Knives Out is probably still the stronger movie for me. It's probably less accessible to a general audience than this one. But I think I think it's probably the better production in general, and I also think it's probably the one that will age better than this one. However, for a contemporary viewer, I think they are both pretty excellent. And while I would recommend watching Knives Out, I think this is a very good use of your time. It's also, now since it's on Netflix almost immediately for its release, it's, you know, if you have that subscription, and it is one of the most common subscriptions for people to have to streaming services, it's a nice thing to see produced for a streaming service without sort of hampering its creativity and the options that it has. And I'll continue to give as much credit as one can to a media production company, a media conglomerate, let's say, for continuing to produce things that are outside the norm of what is typically seen. Granted, this one was not that risky because of how massively successful the first one was and the budget and all that, but now I'm going around in circles. Pretty highly recommended. I'm going to stop myself before I try and say more. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'll see you guys next year for something else.